Truth-paste. Whether you are listening to a group of rich or poor people, left or right wing, old or young, minorities or the ruling class, one thing is for certain. Nobody can deny that there is something wrong with the world. In addition to recognizing this very obvious thing, and all it takes is just watching a single news broadcast to figure this out, we hear a plethora of explanations and solutions. I have yet to hear anyone say, perhaps our answers belong to someone that everyone is ignoring. And if we just focus on trying to find people like that, listen to them, and get others to listen, we would find the answers to our problems. The rich want to throw money at problems. The poor people might want to start some kind of revolution. While the liberals and conservatives are convinced that we need more education or more military, fewer guns or more guns, more government, less religion, and maybe even putting prayer back in schools will solve the problem. I might say that a lot of people on either side of these societal paradigms would agree that a root of these problems is greed, but greedy for what and why? Money can't buy everything, so why would rich people wanting too much money be such an issue? Folks often do mention the possibility of how too much power corrupts, in addition to repeating cliches and basically never getting to what kind of power they want. Why do they want power? And perhaps trying to solve that power problem. Decentralizing power? That can be a fairly healthy start, but not the answer. I learned something the hard way. In fact, I could have cost me a relationship. I really hurt someone I loved very much, and the story is more surreal than it is sad. My partner at the time was an older man, over 20 years, my senior, and although we got along pretty well, there was a time when he was getting abusive to the point where I couldn't live with him anymore, but we never did set an emergency separation plan in case that were to ever occur. Unfortunately, we were living in a travel trailer far away from the city at the time, and I simply ran out of ideas on where he could stay during a separation. I tried everything I could think of, and I didn't know what to do. His behavior was causing my mental health to get out of control to where I could no longer cope. And I also couldn't find a way for me to be alone. After several days, I finally told him that unless he started treating me better, he was going to have to leave. Since everything was in my name, that left him basically homeless. But I also knew that his church would take care of him like they always had before, and if not, the local senior center had resources. And although I knew that he would not literally be left out in the cold, his nervous system had another perspective. In fact, he believed that I was literally going to drop him off and leave him alone on the street in front of some building. He's never been homeless like I have, so his fear of what was always more intense than my perspective, but nothing like the perspective of being a senior citizen. His worst fear was to be thrown out, and that's a reality for a lot of seniors who are single and poor. I had no idea how devastating this was to him for me to even consider such a thing, even though what he imagined was quite different from what I was really trying to communicate. That was the last time I can think of where I did something devastatingly hurtful to someone close to me. It's been several years, and it still haunts me. What troubled me the most was how I felt during the time I gave him that painful ultimatum. This was one of the things that gave me insight into those who abuse their power. I rarely have any power these days, so I simply don't have the opportunity to abuse it. Although when I was younger, I did have times where I took advantage of my positions I had over others. Most of my life, I suffered at the hands of those who took advantage of their positions over me. And I wondered how these people can live with themselves and sleep at night. This is where things get spooky. It felt good. In fact, it felt very good. I was hurting him deeply, and I was feeling very good about the whole thing. From a rational perspective, giving an ultimatum to a sort of tenant like this, because I literally was his landlord, there was nothing really wrong with that, especially considering the fact that I had intended on making sure he had an adequate and safe place to stay, in addition to the fact that I needed to keep myself safe from him as well. Basically, the way I saw it, he was wrong and I was right. I don't remember considering whether this would have that kind of impact it would. Although if I had thought through things carefully, I would have considered his perspective and how he might have misunderstood me. That was my first realization about the incident. It felt right, in quotes there. The other thing was that I had the power to do that, and abusing my power actually made me feel more powerful. In addition to feeling justified, it felt so weirdly good. I was using that good feeling as an indicator that I was making the right decision. That was one of my biggest realizations during the incident. I might almost say that I felt, quote, drunk, end quote, on my power, and that the abuse of power is an accelerator to what other power someone has over another. A tube of toothpaste is meant to be squeezed. Then there is that one or two sacred servings left. I hate throwing out. I heard my dad was like this too. I contend with that tube of toothpaste and struggle with it until I know that without a doubt I have consumed every single molecule of that chalky goodness that I humanly can accomplish. This makes me feel good, stingy, but overall I feel good. On the other hand, people are not meant to be squeezed to get stuff out of them. We freely give, freely receive, and hope to have a fair and equal exchange between both parties. It is when a person is treated like a tube of toothpaste. I'm getting stuff out of you when I need it until I'm done with you, and when you stop putting out, I'm going to do whatever I can get what I believe is mine. That's the mind of the abuser. The abuser thinks that they own the victim. They put themselves in a place of power, whether literally or using cultic and psychological tactics to overpower their victim. It's part of their spooky nature that might give them the ability to, whether conscious of it or not, they can probe into the worst fears and hurts of their victim and use those to take advantage when they want. The theology of the power abuse addict. Although I had sincerely sought forgiveness soon after the incident, it took him a long time to forgive me after we broke up. This experience gave me a brief perspective of what it's like to be an abuser. The insight I gained helped me to see that when I contending with a powerful person who's using their power to hurt me, from their vantage point, their instincts, their intuition, and a sort of gut feeling to confirm that they're doing the right thing. In addition to all these good feelings is a sort of drunken high that they get while hurting someone from their place of power. It draws power from the abuser in the context that it's the way things are supposed to be. The intoxicating rush of power is amplified by the amount of pain that is caused to those subject to them. If you have ever heard stories from prisoners of war, those who have suffered sexual assault or other forms of torture, you might hear how an abuser is in some kind of trance, even resembles someone who is heavily drugged and not very conscious of what's going on. The cries for mercy and everything that has to do with humanity, compassion, and empathy are blocked out at those moments. From their perspective, the feelings they get from the hurt inflicted help cause their state of delusion. They feel like they are doing some kind of job, taking responsibility. They believe whatever they need to believe, often without even trying to purposefully brainwash themselves. The intoxicating rush they get from their actions can be convincing enough that they need it and need more and more to cope. When someone gets attention, it feels right because they must be doing something right to deserve getting attention. It's the same way with positions of authority. Leaders feel like they deserve it. The power feels good. And it feels not only normal and the right thing to be, they feel wrong when they lose it. In fact, they feel miserable when they lose a little bit of their power, like a fish out of the water. Oftentimes, they can't cope. This is why I find it so agonizing to hang out with people who have recently retired or lost a position in management. Their life feels wrong. They were used to tapping into all those people. Most powerful people don't need to torture others in order to cope. There are certain pathologies and situations that can create those kinds of abuse situations. But for the most part, the abuse of power is so subtle that nobody around notices it. In addition to the victim and the abuser not being aware that anything is wrong. Users and abusers can be somewhat different, although the results can be similar. A user squeezes a regular and reasonable amount of toothpaste out of a tube before discarding it, while the abuser tries everything they can to get everything out of a person, no matter how forceful. Users know what they can get away with and try to get what they can until they no longer use that particular person, and they're on to the next one. Similarly, abusers know what they can get away with, in addition to seeing people as objects to be discarded when done. The difference is the pathologies of the two and the amount of harm inflicted on their victims. Power getting can be explained in a similar way that money getting can. Let's say you sign up with a big financial firm and get a nice bunch of mutual funds. You have no idea that your particular agent had no personal convictions concerning investing in oil, tobacco, firearms, military contracts, drug companies, and maybe a few other that snuck in there, that he had indirect ties to criminal organizations. After a few years, you remember that you had those mutual funds and are delighted that your investments have made you quite a little fortune. With all that money, you can give to friends and family members in need, supported some charity work, put the rest into your dream business. It all felt good. It all felt right. You had no idea the kinds of suffering that supporting those industries indirectly caused. All you know is that you made good financial choices and were able to do a lot of good deeds with it. I tried to explain this concept to someone who had an uncanny ability to get power easily. A common response from people like this is that, well, their power comes from God, or in this case, a trendy metaphysical term, source. I tried to gently convince them that Power in itself is fluid, like money. It all feels the same, no matter what the source. When someone puts money in my bank account, it's just added to the existing balance. It doesn't show up as anything different, nor is any dollar worth anything different from the dollars that were there before. If I buy something with that bank card after the mystery money was deposited, I can use it for something good or bad, no matter if the money deposited was by a thief or money acquired legally. I can buy a yummy pizza, and it will taste just as yummy. Some might argue that if I were caught and accused of knowing and spending stolen funds, there obviously could be ramifications. In addition, spiritual people would argue that the cash would have had bad vibes and some sort of spirit tainting the money with evil energy or something like that. The point I was trying to make was that we don't always know or acknowledge the source of our power. We just know that it feels deserving, comfortable, and basically feels good, and that it's the right thing to have. This particular person was not only a strong leader in the community, but there was also a lot of psychic energy healing stuff going on. This is where things get a bit spooky. When someone is recognized at being successful at what I consider faith healing, whether it's some kind of New Age or Christian practice or whatever, or I am certain about one thing. Just because they might be using their power to do good things for others, that does not guarantee that their power was obtained with good intentions or good sources. History is full of renowned spiritual leaders who were really mean to those who worked with them. Because of my former background as a Christian fundamentalist and a musical accompanist, I have met people like this and have worked for some of them. I also worked closely with metaphysical and shamanic practitioners who fit the same kinds of misunderstandings. If this power is unholy, I wouldn't have these healing abilities. Some of these people weren't just mean, they were just downright cruel. And some abused substances, abused children, and did other deplorable things. When people give too much attention to a leader, that power begins to turn a regular human into a god. These powerful leaders might also be making themselves into gods intentionally, or, like a lot of spiritual and practical leaders, in addition to public figures like entertainers and artists, some people have no intention of becoming some kind of venerated idol. Some of these worshipped people have been good at resisting the temptation to give in to the deification of themselves and have remained in various states of humility. However, in my opinion, most of these folks began to believe that they were some kind of god, or like Apollo or Clapton. The funny thing about these phony God people is that they can ironically be the very thing that they use in order for them to believe for the miracle they want. Some asshole can be recognized as having healing power, and believers flock to him and actually get answers to their prayers. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that Jesus of Nazareth was just some kind of innovative entrepreneur, finding ways to establish a profitable career and deciding that being a faith healer would be a boon. The book of Luke, verses 8:43 through 48 in the King James Version says, "And a woman having an issue of blood 12 years, which had spent all of her living upon physicians and neither could be healed of any, came behind him and touched the border of his garment, and immediately her issue of blood snatched. And Jesus said, 'Who touched me?' When all denied, Peter And they that were with him said, Master, the multitude throng these and press thee, thou saying, Who touched me? And Jesus said, Somebody hath touched me, for I perceive that virtue is gone out of me. And when the woman saw that she was not hid, she came trembling and falling down before him. She declared unto him before all the people for what cause she had touched him, and how good she was healed immediately. And he said to her, Daughter, be of good cheer and comfort. Thy faith had made thee whole. Go in peace. Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell this story about a lady with a chronic bleeding problem who gave up on getting more doctors. She heard the news about this faith healer guy and found him. The thing that I find most interesting about this particular instance, Jesus of Nazareth did not claim to have healed her, but her faith did. It was almost as if she were the one responsible, and she just needed something or someone as the object of her faith. Acting on that faith brought her the miracle, not some kind of person or thing. But the fact that Jesus of Nazareth was very popular, had a lot of influence, and possessed a lot of power, that he was highly recognized, that could have been enough for anyone to call themselves a faith healer. Jesus said, Thy faith has made thee whole. He didn't say, you could have touched the hem of the garment of anyone else's clothes because any asshole could have done this, as long as he has the right kind of reputation. But he very well could have said something like that, based on the principle, minus the word asshole. Therefore, ranking, status, power, recognition, influence, popularity, and other alpha traits can not only provide a lot of perks in life, these characteristics can also be a catalyst for spiritual power. There have likely been, and still may be, women and men who sincerely possess spiritual gifts. I believe this to be true. It is also true that there are a lot of fakes who strangely get a lot of results. Close to 99% of what I have witnessed to be some kind of supernatural or unexplainable phenomenon produced in the context of a spiritual person is inauthentic in my experience. Basically, when there's some things that seem superhuman, assume it is fake, especially considering how much power that person has over others. If there is a sincerely spiritually gifted person, also consider that there might be some kind of mix-up in those two powers at work. In addition, having studied the lives of a lot of faith healers from different religious backgrounds, please consider how they started and what kind of power they might have actually possessed in their latter career, especially if they had gotten significantly famous as a result. Analyzing concepts like these might allow many to refer to this as earthly power as opposed to spiritual power. Although I won't argue with those terms, I like to look deeper into what this earthly or worldly power is, in addition to discerning it clearly, because it really can be godlike, captivating, and bewitching. Understand what power is. It was attributed to Jesus in the song Poor Jerusalem from Jesus Christ Superstar, written by Tim Rice. Understand what power is. The future. I like to start things and see if they fly. Sometimes they don't even get off the ground. Sometimes they fly for a little bit and get shot down. Often my things in the past have just floated away and they were forgotten about. One of those things I like to do is to start joke organizations that look like real organizations. I don't ask for money. I just like to use sleek-looking stock photos and trendy-sounding terms while concluding it with something that's as believable as it is ironic in order to mock what fake charities are doing these days and exploiting various kinds of people. At the same time, I like to start real groups, and sometimes I post part-time opportunities for my little production business. These are great ways to explore new models when it comes to things like diversity statements. A diversity statement is a standard and often legal thing that is listed on various documents and web pages, trying to protect various underprivileged people. These often have little to no actual protective value and are, in my experience, more of a marketing and PR tool. We also see them in a lot of government and educational entities, and even a lot of churches write rhetoric like this. If you want to be a cool kid with your organization and impress smart people, you should include things like this: race, religion, age, gender expression, sexual orientation, economic class, disability status, language, culture, national origin, and maybe even political affiliation, if they dare. Something else people might add is marital status, although I don't see that enough, especially when adding things that apply to the homeless. Others differentiate sex and gender and further elaborate on the difference between color and race. One particular organization in Big Rapids added social class to its list. In some countries that clearly live under a caste system, they might add something like that to their list. I decided I would add characteristics like caste, C-A-S-T-E, and social status to my diversity statements just to see if I could start some trends. During this book project, I haven't seen this fly yet, and I am hopeful that we see more acknowledgement of issues that face underdog types. Even if I did start a trend of adding caste to diversity statements, I don't think it would further point to what I'm trying to make. The problem I am having is with the word caste, is that it has a lot of baggage because of places like India, where Westerners like to badmouth caste systems. In addition, I have dealt with the flow of denial of whether Western society, in particular the United States, functions in a caste system. If that ever gets acknowledged, and rarely does it ever, especially in the context of the United States, I have found that it is from the perspective of influencers who focus on underprivileged groups and family of origin issues. In my past research, I have also not found any correlation with caste system issues and the attention economy, just the classical views of the economy. Although there are diversity statements in the Western world that do in fact use the word caste, it is often in the context of class. I have seen it worded as caste/caste in a lot of places, including discourses related to diversity studies. The point I'm trying to make with all of this diversity stuff is that alpha-related issues have to do with caste systems in the context of the attention economy. I am not talking specifically about economic status, but attention status. If an economy can be established on attention as well as finances, I believe that a society can acknowledge that just as there are economic classes, there are attention classes as well. Simply stated, as individuals existing in various groups of rich and poor people for whatever reason remain ignored. Therefore, we cannot say there's a ghetto full of underdogs because among their own ranks, they all have levels of status and privilege, even if, as a whole, they are treated less than most communities. At the same time, there are affluent neighborhoods that contain countless suffering people who are overlooked for their potential and accomplishments, as well as lower and middle-class areas. I have lived this phenomenon myself, having worked and lived among rich and poor, in addition to being raised in what many might call upper middle class. Based on the abuse and trauma I suffered growing up at the bottom of that pecking order, I must admit that without the social privileges I possessed, I would have likely suffered more and may not have survived, especially considering my disabilities. Something I reluctantly say often, even taking into account my recent experiences traveling alone in some risky places. Considering my interactions with the authorities, if I were black, I wouldn't be alive today. That bites. Throughout the middle of the 20th century, the common mid-century view of the future was a mostly positive one. Happy and healthy families riding to work on rocket ships and friendly robots making their lives easier. By the end of that century, though, the trend of the future stories became darker and less positive. This could have been partly because of the hopeful young generation of the 1960s losing hope by the end of the 1970s and creating a different view of the future of humanity that became more accepted in later generations. As much as I would rather not sit through more depressing post-apocalyptic shows, I also don't like a lot of the positive outlook shows. The reason is that although there are franchises like Star Trek that present a world that has conquered poverty and sickness, they still show a very unfair, unequal system based on status and rank. In fact, with all of that fancy technology that enables them to teleport several miles away and fly faster than light, they still run Starfleet like an old-fashioned military. This hopeful view of the future is constantly tainted with the abuse of power and constant problems with all of this advanced stuff, ironically trying to function with old-world government and outdated social models. Writing this book in the mid-2020s reminds me of a two-part episode produced in the 1990s of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, where some of the characters were stuck in the 2020s. It showed an uprising of those who were trapped in a lower caste and trying to fight their way out. The lower caste people were made up of a very diverse group, which I thought was an interesting choice of those who wrote and produced those episodes. Every time I watch through that series in recent years, I try to skip those episodes. It's just too triggering. I did notice that after I started realizing how prophetic those episodes were, I saw that other Star Trek fans were starting to comment. I just hope they observe how the concept of caste these days transcends racial and cultural demographics in addition to economic class. Another example is how the upper caste is portrayed in the Hunger Games franchise. With all of this hyper-focusing on relevant issues like racial and gender equality, it's easy to lose sight of individuals who are overlooked and invisible. Although there are always solutions to social problems, this issue is one of the most difficult, if not the most challenging. There's simply no way that we can offer tangible evidence whether someone is considered an alpha, an underdog, or a runt. It's easy to do the math and assess someone's economic class or simple DNA test to determine someone's race, but to confirm and mark every born leader with a star on their belly would be ironically counterproductive to this social justice cause and would, as a result, create an additional social justice travesty. With the occasional acknowledgement of caste system dynamics that exist in the media, whether fiction or nonfiction, there obviously needs to be a lot of reminders of the fact that there are so many people being left out, overlooked, and excluded, resulting in being invisible. When writing the plot to a movie script, underdog stories are actually a real category, especially in the movies. These are sometimes based on real stories. But whether the stories are actually real or not, the outcomes are, in my opinion, horribly unrealistic. Even non-fiction underdog stories are deceptive because they handpick situations that are extremely rare, in addition to making sure that the story depicts leaders who are benevolent enough to apparently share their power. A few of these stories that came to mind are Rudy from 1993 and movie Radio from 2003. Results not typical. If you attend a seminar at a real estate scam and hear a dozen testimonies of those who got successful in that stupid program, it should be clear to those that not typical stories. In fact, it's not unusual to see a legal disclaimer that states something to that effect. But we watch these beloved underdog movies that all seem to end the same way, where the underdog becomes the alpha at the end, with all of those best-selling books and blockbusters like this. I cannot help but wonder why society has such an obsession with underdog stories. Could it be the same reason that people like magical fantasy stories, religious stories of miracles, superheroes, basically everything unreal? We want to escape reality. I don't blame anyone for wanting to. We like to see rocket cars, dragons, Moses parting the Red Sea. But something I don't hear being talked about is how unreal these underdog stories really are. Most of our society is made up of underdogs, and even the alphas feel that they are underdogs, while the runts of the world are so miserable that they love to engage themselves in fantasy, hoping that one day they'll be magically transformed into an alpha. We like to believe this happens in the world on a regular basis. However, just the opposite is true. Alphas bite their followers and may even kill them if they become alphas, unless they are somehow able to possess more power than they do. These are indeed anomalies. The rule is that the powerful stay in power and, for the most part, grow in power, and vice versa. The exception is when someone who is at the fundamental level, who is clearly not the born leader type, is given power and remains in power. This power is always given, although sometimes not intentionally. Sometimes it happens by accident. Sometimes it is taken by force. But every time there is a shift in personal power, it is always given by at least one person. Fighting your way out of obscurity? So often, unfortunately, power is taken aggressively. In some societies, this is so common that it is tolerated. In most modern societies, acts of aggression are met with the loss of power, thus taking power aggressively is, for the most part, very counterproductive. I also have an ethical dilemma about aggression and do not think it is necessary, although there might be exceptions based on how clearly an oppressive environment might be. One of my favorite examples of this principle is a fictional story about a prison break. Ironically, based on a story written by the King of Horror, Stephen King. A movie was produced called The Shawshank Redemption. Writing almost exclusively about horror, I wonder if King might have wanted to tell a story about something that we all fear: being trapped. In addition to being stuck, there was the fear of being falsely accused. These are two constant realities for those trapped at the bottom of society, unable to free themselves no matter how loud and strong they are. They are contained in a prison that society has made to keep them invisible and powerless. The reason why I use this story so much as an example of this type of personal transformation is that it took patience, creativity, knowledge, and perseverance. The protagonist did not use violence or threats to get his way out. The transition of being an underdog to an alpha dog is no small feat, especially if you are the runt of your community. If biting and clawing your way to power only causes more harm and risk to yourself and to your life, there must be another way out. Perhaps it's not so much the case for women who are trapped in obscurity to threaten violence because of so much history of men who are, alone, decide to get a lot of attention using fear and violence. I've never heard of any of these attempts at getting attention or justice being productive, and these men end up institutionalized or dead as a result. The lone wolf terrorist is a sad example of a man who has either lost his power or can no longer live the powerless life he was given. One of these bombers in recent years told someone before killing himself, "I'm going to be famous." There are a lot of men who have worked hard, suffered, obeyed authorities, and ended up living trapped in a sort of powerless state where they are treated as worthless and invisible. This causes people, especially men who feel more accustomed to having power, to basically self-destruct. This can take many forms, whether acting out in violence, for instance, the sad and unfortunately common suicide by cop scenario, substance abuse, symptoms of severe mental illness, or sadly, even people literally blowing themselves up. Sometimes I wonder how I have survived suffering in a crowdsourced punishment of solitary confinement, especially when there was no crime, nor even a trial. I decided over the years that I was determined to find a peaceful and creative solution to rise out of professional obscurity, among other ways that civilization had tried to make me invisible and forgotten about. This is where I decided that instead of making myself some kind of public spectacle, trying to hold my hometown in some type of media hostage situation, that I would totally start over and think outside the box. My integrated approach to creating this new life, including years of interdisciplinary studies, personal growth and healing, and in addition to creative efforts and experimenting in faith-based practices. As part of my progress, I was also practicing more behaviors that I would consider expressions of self-respect. With compassion, empathy, and the most tact I can produce without being rude, I decided to make a habit of wagging my tail less and barking more. Personal transformation. Standing up for myself was not an easy habit to develop. I had my old thinking patterns to contend with, in addition to how very little society valued me. I also had to manage my emotions so as not to hurt others nor discredit myself in the process. This had led to much backlash, although for the most part I am quite proud of myself, even though at times I do admit I could have been more tactful. There are two realms that I'm projecting this energy of personal empowerment to: the invisible realms and the visible realms. The visible realms of existence are what I would consider my social life, work, home, and other relationships that affect my well-being. Making a habit of defending myself while not being defensive isn't easy. However, I believe that it slowly undermines the thinking habits of others who want to try to view me and treat me as someone way less valuable than I am. When it comes to self-image, I make it a regular practice to view myself as objectively as possible. This is difficult for those of us who have been alienated and often results in extreme perspectives of one's self-image. One day you're the Messiah, the next you're a worm. Another habit is to carefully state the facts while not bragging. This is also difficult to find that balance, although I have put into practice a few tactics that have helped. One of them is not being a name dropper, as well as testing the water to determine if others are receptive. If someone doesn't seem lucid enough to take in facts, I won't scare them with evidence. For instance, there were a lot of times when I met phonies who claimed to be in some type of creative career. I initiated a session of show and tell. Rarely do they ever have anything to provide. Well, I pull up some examples of my published works on the web, especially some in the context of had the thousands of social media engagement type numbers. Aside from bombarding the world with my content, my ideas, and projects like this audiobook and other related material, in addition to asserting myself and standing up to opposition, the area I am projecting my power is through faith practices. Although I try to affirm people's religious and spiritual beliefs, I found the best is to rely on most secular forms of prayer and magic, so as to not willingly give my power to anything or anyone in visible realms as well as the invisible. One of those practices is the universal art of positive affirmation, in addition to other ways to send out this empowering energy to the invisible realms. This way, I am bombarding the multiverse with positive energy, just as I am bombarding the physical world with other empowering efforts. Buzz off. In recent years, I have been known to boldly ask for visibility when I am working with some type of venue or creativity-related project. I find a tactful way to make sure that I am not kept invisible and get fair and equal exposure. I follow up and give examples and try my best to keep the peace at the same time. Most importantly, if there is one thing that I ask when I am becoming a part of something with other public figures, like teachers, artists, media, or entertainers, or sadly, charity and activism groups, is that I ask that if the need arises, there would be conflict resolution. This enables me to gauge whether any unfair treatment is related to something questionable that I have done, or if it is simply just me that's the problem. If they agree to take any alleged offenses to my attention, I trust that I would be treated with honesty and respect that was agreed upon. I also observe if others are getting the same treatment. Not every environment is as inclusive as it claims. Some places cater towards age groups that do not represent me or other traits like gender and religion. Some places are just homophobic and won't admit it. If I have done nothing wrong, and I am not treated with fairness, based on the context of these studies, I think it would be safe to conclude that there are a lot of environments that, whether conscious of it or not, they simply recognize what they consider a leader, and everyone else is expected to take their place, and if not, they are ostracized. Followers are expendable. Another fact about the universe is that I can be quite unpleasant at times, especially around elitists. However, everyone, whether pleasant or unpleasant, deserves equal treatment, which includes things like fair methods of conflict resolution. I can cite countless experiences, even within the past year or so, where I was being misunderstood or mistreated while working or volunteering. Although rarely explicitly stated, it is shocking when I get ejected as a result of just prompting a discussion like this, followed by something like, "We resolved the situation by firing you." I even recently had a doctor cancel a follow-up appointment and drop me as a patient just because I wanted to resolve a miscommunication. In these incidents, I have tried being as tactful and non-confrontational as I could, and with the same negative results. These things could be worse. I am surprised that this isn't common knowledge in the United States, but did you know, based on various traits of the victim, that law enforcement typically feels like there are more legal consequences for injuring someone rather than killing them? Although shocking, I have had to explain this to more than one person in recent years, even though from my perspective it should be obvious. The dead can't sue you. Therefore, it has to do with a variable concerning whether the victim will have anyone seeking justice, thus a status-related issue. This is a sad but perhaps effective way to gauge social status, even among the authorities, may consider to be entirely defenseless. They may not realize someone may speak out. This was the case with Philip James Chassie Jr. in 2006. I could write another book about my similarities and my dealings with people involved in this horrific killing of an innocent man. But one thing is for certain, most of these cases are never known or remembered. The family of Jim and other responsible parties, based on my standards, basically abandoned and neglected him, except for after he died. The Portland Police Department probably assumed he was just another bum and didn't expect that incident to hit the press like it did. I've been fired from more jobs than anyone else I know. Some of it was based on issues I could have improved. However, I believe most of it had to do with disability issues, abuse of power, and maybe some homophobia. Although I have never been shot at by the police, I have suffered everything from a blockade to threats, harassment, and other unfair or extreme measures based on little to no crime involved. Mostly it's because I'm trying to resolve issues with greedy property owners who abuse the legal system to rid themselves of me. In the context of law enforcement, I have said this before and I will say it again. If I were black, I'd be dead. Besides being ejected from a lot of positions and roles throughout my lifetime, I am lucky to be alive, considering how many outspoken underdogs disappear from society. The concept of murder can have 3 different meanings based on entirely different social status. Killing an alpha is not always considered murder because it's often labeled as an assassination based on their power. Besides motive, one part of a definition of an assassination is the victim is a prominent or influential person, such as a political leader, celebrity, or activist. Killing an underdog can be considered murder as long as the victim has at least one person to advocate for justice. Killing a runt has a lot of different terms. Suicide by cop is one of the worst, often associated with houseless men. Instead of murder, most reports in the media cite these tragedies as shootings or killings instead of murders. This has been a particularly controversial subject, not only in my hometown of Portland, Oregon, but other places I've traveled and lived, like Central Texas, where in a neighboring town, an unarmed man of color was murdered. And where I currently live in southern Arizona, there was an indigenous man who was brutally murdered by Border Patrol. Having been personally involved in various degrees with these incidents, I have yet to really see justice. Another thing I have not observed is references to the fact that all these victims were perceived as defenseless in every way, before and after they were murdered. Whether anyone knows about these murders depends on whether the victim was defenseless after they died. What I have noticed, especially when trying to work with others in the context of working with the public, is that social ranking messes everything up in my experience. Staff and board meetings are mostly about who's heard the most, regardless of whether they have anything reasonable to say. There are subtle insults so tactfully injected that nobody but the victim and the perpetrator knows what was really being said. The runt of the group won't have her or his ideas even considered. The leaders might use trendy terms like, "Let's table that," or meaning, "Shut up, you runt. You're here to listen and admire us. We have no intention of reviewing anything later." Every time I was cut down when contributing in a meeting, table, which means to postpone something, had never been addressed any time after those meetings. When it comes to being kept invisible and silent, those lower in social status in any organization are treated the worst when it comes to conflict resolution, or lack of it. Think about it this way. The top alphas of the group do not require conflict resolution because they will win anyways, and no need to resolve anything when they basically do whatever they want and remain in power. The runt of the group doesn't require conflict resolution because she or he is expendable. One strike and they're out. Time to get a new runt. After all, somebody has to take the blame. I have witnessed forms of conflict resolution where members of a group might be considered somewhere in the middle. This might be the underdogs that are not necessarily the runts at the bottom, but the ones that are harder to replace and are considered somewhat valuable. That is where leaders might be more willing to resolve conflict situations. But conflict resolution takes time, humility, and can be painful. So that also explains why I see very little of it happening, especially directed towards those at the very bottom or at the tippy top of an organization. When people see a group of people that shine with positive attention and collect a lot of numbers, I typically see something different. Groups of overrated people tend to enable each other. They also tend to be in a lot of denial of how overrated they are. Their overconfidence spreads throughout their circles and is met with an overabundance of praise from their followers. It has gotten to the point for well over a decade that I cringe when I hear the word collective, used to label various groups like this. Underrated people often do not get together for various reasons. Most of them are so shell-shocked that they can't function well enough to get along and, either by choice or not, reluctantly try to function in solitude. Being ignored for someone's entire life makes them go insane. For instance, Ludwig Boltzmann, whose atomic theory was later vindicated in 1905. Albert Einstein published his paper on Brownian motion. But Boltzmann never saw the proof, and he died by suicide in 1906 after a lifetime of professional criticism. Another reason that is a group of ignored people get together and create things that, well, basically, unfortunately, get ignored. That's why underrated people are trying to bang on the front doors of places that are getting attention. They are allowed in as long as they clean their toilets, wag their bushy tails, and lick them with kisses of affection. A decade ago, I tried to reason with a leader I worked for about his unfair treatment. This was before I knew what the hell was going on in the world. I expected him to be a human being. I was astonished. Everyone knew that I was the most experienced audio producer in the group, and I was wondering why nobody was following up with what seemed to be agreeing on when it came to me providing my skills. I finally wanted answers, in addition to how my disability status was also overlooked and exploited. As tactful as I could be, there was no way to get through to him. Trying to make sense of what happened, I tried to paint a picture in my mind of what it felt like. It was as if I were a honeybee, and all the power I had was to sting someone. I had one chance, and then it would kill me. So what's the point? In addition, whether I sting someone or not, they may not have a stinger per se, but they do have the power to squash the bee and squash as many bees as they want, and they still get to live. It's a losing game. So I might as well just buzz off, and I did, and it drove me further into a deep depression.